For many years, we were sold a very expensive fairy tale about a man who outplayed everyone, calculated everything, and holds the world by the throat. He is a strategist, a master of multi-move games, the one who controls everyone and everything. The radiant, sober, young, and energetic leader who lifted Russia from its knees. But there's one problem. The further we get from the beginning of this story, the less it resembles the truth. Because if you strip away the pomp, turn off the TV, and just look at the facts, a completely different picture starts to emerge. It is a bleak and vivid picture, in which the grand strategies ultimately end in complete and utter failures. Allies turn into those who merely use him. His own system repeatedly lies directly to his face. And he makes decisions that only serve to make things significantly worse. And then a very unpleasant question arises. What if, instead of a strategist, a player, or a predator, what we have before us is a person who has spent his whole life trying to prove that he's not a pushover? And that's precisely why, time and again, he proves to everyone that he's not just a pushover, but a pushover to the extreme. Where did he even come from? How did he end up at the top? And why does his path more and more begin to resemble not a story of strength, but a story of constant failures that he himself creates? And most importantly, how could all of this end? Because stories like this usually have only one ending. To better understand how the train driven by Putin is heading toward the abyss on crooked tracks, we need to figure out where those crooked tracks were laid. And that happened in the back alleys of St. Petersburg, where the boy grew up, where he was regularly beaten into the dust and humiliated. Moreover, he was constantly put down and unloved. Judging by the size of today's compensations, we can speak about this openly. This story doesn't begin in the Kremlin, not in the KGB, not in closed offices. It starts in an ordinary Soviet communal apartment. So, the year is 1952, Leningrad. No elite, no connections, no future presidents. An ordinary post-war family. The father was a laborer, the mother a nurse, a cleaning lady, a woman who survived the siege. And so this future gatherer of lands grows up in a communal apartment where he has nothing, where he has to share the kitchen, the toilet, and his life with strangers. And if you want to wash yourself, you have to walk to the nearby Nekrasov baths. You might say almost everyone lived like that. But that's not true. Vovochka was regularly beaten by his despotic, aggressive father, who was prone to humiliation and violence. It's no surprise that the first emotions of this intimidated boy from Petersburg were fear and hatred. Soon, a persecution complex was added to them, an obsessive idea that everyone was against him. He endured it. The first school of survival for the future victim was the street. People love to sell this story, like the kid grew up in the yard and became a real man. But let's be honest, in such conditions, the yard isn't a leadership training ground. It's a small simulator of violence. There, they don't teach you to negotiate, but to sense who is stronger, who you can answer back to, and who you can't. The yard where Vovochka grew up was thoroughly steeped in criminal culture. Children grew up absorbing the logic of the criminal world. Wolf laws reigned here. There were bosses and there were their servants. The yard hierarchy of Baskov Lane closely resembled the structure of the prison world. This was evident not only in the rules but also in the language. He endured. Vova grew up, but the criminal slang never went away.
We will pursue terrorists everywhere, in the airport. So, excuse me, but if we catch them in the restroom, we'll take them out right there, even in the toilet in the end. That's it, the matter is closed for good.
And now Putin himself tells a story in the style of the obvious. Incredible, about how as a child he played in the basement and cornered a big rat, and it turned around and attacked him. Little Vova ran away and endured it. And it seems the boy even drew the right conclusion from this story. You shouldn't corner a rat. The only problem is that little Vova, with his first barely noticeable signs of mental disorders, started to see himself as that rat. Many years later, world leaders eagerly picked up this fable. You can't put pressure on Putin, you can't corner him, or else he'll grab nuclear weapons and lash out. But to demonize a victim is to make a very big mistake. In fact, demonization is an admission of his strength, when in reality there is no strength there at all. Vovochka is not a rat bravely fighting for its life, but a boy who ran away from a rodent. He had a stick in his hands. He could have fought off the dangerous opponent, but instead he ran away cowardly. He has been running and hiding his whole life, starting with the Kursk submarine.
It sank.
And ending with the Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries, when Putin crawled out of his bunker and reacted to the disaster in 2 hours. After the third strike, how many days did everything keep burning? And what was the nation's leader doing at that time? He congratulated boxers, met with the president of Seychelles, and visited an exhibition about Zhirinovsky, because you can simply run away from the problem, hide in your little house, just like during Prigozhin's mutiny, of course. History loves to joke, but even more, it loves to punish those who have not learned its first and most important lesson. Putin regularly applies this wrong lesson at the state level, and this becomes a problem. After all, what do we see next in life? Chechnya, Transnistria, Georgia, Syria, Ukraine, the opposition, the West, his own elites. All his life, he has done exactly the opposite. He tries to corner everyone, is surprised every time they bite back, and once again has to run away. In the courtyards of St. Petersburg, a basic mindset was formed in the boy who was always picked on. Either you adapt, or you get pushed around. And a little later, he learned another rule. If you don't want to be a victim again, strike first. In this way, Putin developed his initial effective framework. Putin is not a leader and never has been. He is not the kind of person people follow because they believe in him. He is the one who adapts, waits, and strikes at the moment he considers safe for himself, when he is sure there will be no retaliation. After all, the boy was beaten often, a lot, and painfully. Putin is not a leader. He is a person who has spent his whole life avoiding the position of the weak. And so, when such a person gains power, he doesn't build a system of trust or justice. He builds a system where no one can ever call him a victim again because he is running from that truth. People love to be told the story about judo, as if it's some kind of deep philosophy that he has absorbed. Calmness, harmony, control. Yes, of course. Now let's see what Putin himself said about this. The street skills were no longer enough. He turned to sports. Let me translate that into plain Russian. I was constantly getting beaten up and I got tired of it. I thought, if I learn how to fight, they'll stop beating me. This isn't the way of the samurai. It's a struggle for survival that many have gone through. But when you're a victim in life and you have a victim's mindset and then you get power that scales up to the whole country, it's not about being strong, but about being dangerous. Not about being successful, but about being inconvenient. Not about earning respect, but about instilling fear. Because if people aren't afraid of you, then you're once again that kid from the neighborhood who can be pushed around. The fear of showing that you're weak has to be constantly suppressed. First in the neighborhood, then at school, then in the KGB, then in Moscow, then in front of the oligarchs, then in front of Ukraine, then in front of the West. The problem is you can't prove it just once. It's an addiction. And that's how a regime of endless proof emerges. We are great, we are strong, we've outplayed everyone. We'll show them now, we can do it again. There's another very telling point. When Putin was young, he wanted to join the KGB. But do you know what attracted him there? Not power, not publicity, not leadership, but the idea that one person can control processes from the shadows. It's no surprise that the specific environment of the KGB quickly picked up on this character. After all, it wasn't a club of geniuses. It was, at that time, a huge bureaucratic machine. There, they valued not charisma and intellect, but loyalty, obedience, and the ability not to ask unnecessary questions. The legalization of violence through the agency only further cemented this framework. Vova needed somewhere to project his hatred, and the KGB gave him that opportunity, turning his emotional outbursts into operational necessity. All of this fits perfectly with what would come next. Shady schemes, covert operations. There are no green uniformed men there. Poisoning with Novichok, backroom deals. They skillfully turned a street survivor into an intelligence officer, a man of the system, and a future master of geopolitics. Of course, all of this is in quotation marks. Believe me, there was nothing even close to James Bond there. There was just an ordinary pale moth who fit perfectly into a system where the main thing is not to stand out. And do you remember the myth about the great spy Putin? It sounds serious, almost scary. But he didn't serve in Washington, London, or Paris, but in Dresden. East Germany, late 80s, the periphery. This is not the center of world intelligence, it's a quiet zone where the Soviet system is already starting to fall apart at the seams. And Putin's role there wasn't that of some super agent, but essentially that of a mid-level person doing humiliating administrative work. No high-profile operations, no global victories, no legendary stories. He endured. And then comes the key moment. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. The system is collapsing right before his eyes. And what does the future strong leader do? He calls Moscow and gets the answer. Moscow is silent. This is a real episode that he himself has recounted. So, at the moment when everything is falling apart, he simply waits for orders. But there are no orders. And this is a clear X-ray of his behavioral model. Not a leader, not a decision maker, but someone who waits for instructions from above. And when the system disappears, he is left without support. Later, Putin would call the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. But let's be honest, it's not just about geopolitics, it's personal for him. Because along with the USSR, the system that gave him status, a structure where he was somebody, also collapsed. A world where everything was clear. And once again, he finds himself in a situation with no control, no structure, no guarantees. In other words, he returns to that very state he so despises, a state of vulnerability. Once again, he has to endure. And this is where something begins that will later grow to encompass an entire country. The desire to regain control at any cost. It's reminiscent of the trauma experienced by the young Hitler, who believed that Germany had been betrayed by the first leaders of the Weimar Republic. After the collapse of the USSR, Putin finds himself in his worst nightmare. The vertical hierarchy has disappeared. Instructions no longer work. There are no more orders from above. This is a world where you have to think for yourself. It would seem like the end of history. But a paradox occurs. It is precisely in this chaos that someone like Putin suddenly becomes necessary. Not strong, not brilliant, but simply convenient. Putin joins the team of Anatoly Sobchak, a charismatic and boisterous politician who is truly playing the big game, not just sitting in the corner waiting for instructions. It's very important to understand what little Volodya was doing there. Not ideology, not reforms, and not strategies for the city's development. He was assigned other tasks: contacts, agreements, permits, approvals, access. Simply put, Putin became the person through whom all issues passed. Not the one who makes decisions, but the one who ensures they are carried out. And now the most important point. Why do people like this start to rise? Because in the 90s, everyone is afraid. Politicians are afraid of losing power. Business is afraid of losing money. The security forces are afraid of losing influence. And in such a situation, no one wants a strong, independent player nearby. They don't need a leader, they need an executor. Sobchak loses the election and loses power. His political career essentially collapses. It would seem that's it. The team should leave together with their leader. He endures. When Putin ended up in Moscow, it was no longer the back alleys of St. Petersburg, it was a completely different level. There were no naive games here. Everyone understood everything. Politicians, oligarchs, security officials, they're not a team, they're a pack. Everyone was a competitor. Everyone suspected something. Everyone was looking for each other's weak spots. In such a system, there is a golden rule: never let someone near you who could replace you. And here appears the ideal candidate. Someone who doesn't argue, doesn't push ahead, doesn't play his own game, and doesn't look like a threat. Putin ended up next to Yeltsin and Berezovsky for one simple reason. They fancied themselves the new architects of this world, and they needed a gray, inconspicuous executor with fish-like eyes, someone who wouldn't stand out and, if necessary, would obediently go to prison. At that time, no one saw the dormant paranoia in the obedient errand boy who dutifully carried suitcases for his masters. By the late 90s, when Yeltsin's power began to waver, the country was effectively run by 7 oligarchs, and the people longed for stability. That is precisely why it was decided to appoint a quiet lackey as president, someone who had previously carried other people's briefcases and had neither his own ideology nor ambitions, unlike, for example, Zhuganov. And here is where the main conflict of the entire future story is laid. Putin is chosen because he is weak, and he himself internally wants to be weak. Now the real magic of transformation begins. A person is chosen because he is considered safe, placed at the top, and given access to everything. And at that moment, something happens that for some reason surprises everyone every time. He stops being convenient. He no longer wants to be a pushover. When Putin first comes to power, he behaves perfectly. No sudden moves, no revolutions. And the elites relax. The oligarchs think, this is fine, we can work with him. The politicians think to themselves, he won't meddle in our territory. The system thinks everything is under control. And then comes the classic scenario. Vovka is terrified of becoming a pale nobody again. He can't break everyone at once, so he picks one person. He does it demonstratively, harshly, with no way to turn back. And that one person naturally turns out to be Boris Berezovsky, a man who believed he was the one who helped bring Putin to power. A man who thought he controlled everything. And suddenly, it turns out that he is no longer needed. He is squeezed out, stripped of his influence, forced to leave. And this is the first clear signal that the rules have changed. Gradually, our sufferer, strictly following KGB methods, annihilates his creators. Some he buries in concrete, some he treats to Novichok, and some he turns into mental eunuchs who obediently sit and nod from the podium. In general, to understand the level of cowardice, touchiness, and vindictiveness of Vovochka, it's enough to recall one very telling story from the beginning of his career, the program Puppets on NTV. It was a harsh political satire, not complimentary, not careful, but real, biting, and lively. They made fun of everyone there, and that was considered normal, because in a healthy system, those in power should be able to withstand not only criticism, but also mockery. And then, on air, a simple phrase is heard. Who is Mr. Putin?
Who is Mr. Putin?
This phrase is a reference to the famous moment in the early 2000s, when Putin had just come to power, and the world was trying to figure out who he even was. The audience laughs and applauds. It might seem like just an ordinary joke, but not for him, because for someone with that kind of complex satire isn't just a genre, it's a personal insult. It's a public announcement to the whole country that you're a pushover. And his reaction matched that. He didn't just dislike it, he threw a real tantrum in the spirit of, I'll destroy everyone. The scriptwriter of this program, Viktor Shenderovich, later told us even more interesting things. The presidential administration gave the channel 3 conditions. First, to stop digging up dirt on corruption, especially in the Kremlin, of course. Second, to cover the Chechen war in the right way. And third, the most telling, to remove Putin from the puppets. And here comes a very important comparison. A few years earlier, Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin calmly sat next to his puppet, joked, smiled, and didn't see any tragedy in it at all, because he understood. If you're in power, you'll be parodied, and that's normal. And then a tough guy from the backstreets comes in, starts stomping his foot, making threats, demanding forbidding things, because he can't stand being made to look ridiculous. He has the power not to tolerate mockery anymore. And how did it all end? He won the election. The show was shut down. Shenderovich was removed. A criminal case was opened against NTV owner Gusinsky. The channel itself was seized and handed over to Gazprom. And that's the whole answer to the question, who is Mr. Putin? Not a terrifying genius, not a cold strategist, but a man who can't handle an ordinary joke, who sees laughter as a threat and responds to it with repression. With one hand, he talks about a great power, and with the other, he cleanses television of the puppet that parodies him. Because tanks, missiles, and war are for the outside world. But inside, everything is still simple for him. If people laugh at you, it means they're not afraid of you. It means they understand that you're a fool. And for him, that's the most terrifying disaster. This is not just a struggle for power. A person who has been a doormat all his life, who has always depended on the strong, who has always adapted, now gets the chance to never depend on anyone again. And he takes full advantage of this opportunity. In Soviet culture, there were two concepts, Leniniana and Staliniana. That's when books, songs, and films cultivated the images of leaders as demigods. Lenin is the most humane person, and a big thank you to Stalin for a happy childhood. Never mind that both were former convicts. Well, that's one thing. Or that they drowned the country in blood, which is also important. Putiniana is just as active. Here is the leader riding a horse bare-chested, here he is with a tiger, and here he is at the controls of a bomber. You remember those legendary hockey games where Vovka steps onto the ice and suddenly starts scoring 810 goals per game, right? Seriously, the president of the country, who is over 60, goes up against the best players and crushes them like they're school kids. No, that's not sport, that's a cheap performance. The opponents play along, the defense steps aside, and the goalies just happen to miss at exactly the moment when the puck comes from the main player. The thing is, Vovochka can't allow himself to lose anywhere, neither on the ice, nor on camera, nor in life. Because losing is the moment when the mask cracks, when everyone sees that he's just a loser. He is afraid of fair competition, afraid to be next to someone who is truly stronger, afraid of situations where the outcome can't be agreed upon in advance, where there is no director, no script, no people who will conveniently stumble so that he can look like a hero by comparison. That's why everything around him is just a facade. And in the end, you get a very accurate picture. A small man who, with the help of editors, security, and pre-written scripts, is turned into an invincible leader. On screen, he's an alpha male, but in reality, he's someone who is afraid even of a hypothetical defeat. Because a coward is not only afraid of a fight, a coward is afraid to lose in front of everyone. And they're selling this to us as proof of strength. But let's be honest, if a person is truly strong, he doesn't need to film a new season of Putin in the animal world every year. It's advertising and very intrusive at that, because real strength doesn't need to be validated in prime time. And when you constantly have to remind everyone that you're the alpha, it raises suspicions that things inside aren't so clear-cut. There's another aspect too, where all this Putin-style masculinity starts to smell not like a leather jacket, but like a prison latrine. The Russian prison system has been sustained for years, not just by violence, but by humiliation as a technology of power. In 2021, a massive archive of videos from Russian penal colonies and prison hospitals appeared online. Torture, sexualized violence, and abuse of inmates. This was not about a single excess at a particular place, but about an entire system where a person is broken, it is recorded on video, and then fear is used as a tool of control. In fact, no one was ever really punished for this. Rumor has it that Vovochka personally sat in his bunker in the evenings, rewatching these recordings and enjoying the process. A person who had been humiliated in life himself watched and found validation in seeing others being humiliated. And the most disgusting thing is that this logic was simply exported to the war. Violence against soldiers as a form of torture is used everywhere. So this is no longer just prison culture, it's a method. First, it was tested on their own prisoners, then it was carried further to the occupied territories, to prisoners of war, to civilians. This is what the real Putin vertical looks like. At the top, there is talk about spirituality, traditions, and the Russian world. At the bottom, torture chambers, humiliation, fear, and video archives that explain this regime better than any political scientist ever could. Putin built a cult of strength, but in reality, it is a cult of humiliation. Not of courage, not of order, not of law, but specifically of humiliating the weak by those who have temporarily gained power. This is very Putin-like, to spend your whole life in a panic, afraid of being humiliated, and then build a state where humiliating others becomes part of administrative practice. A strong person does not need to break the helpless. The strong do not need to prove their power through torture, fear, or filming it on camera. But a person who, deep down, has remained a frightened boy from the back alley understands the language of humiliation very well, because it is his native tongue. And that's why, in Putin's Russia, torture is not a glitch. It's the mirror of the system. The system degrades a person to show you are a loser. And at the top sits the one who has spent his whole life running from the feeling that he himself is a loser. With Putin's arrival, a new model of power is taking shape in Russia. It is not about agreements, balance, or competition. It's about subordination. You are either loyal or you are outside the system. You either support or you disappear from the game. And most importantly, no one feels safe anymore. Because if those at the top have been removed, it will be even easier to remove you. And here is the key idea that needs to be stated. Putin did not become strong in the classical sense. He did not win the competition. He simply eliminated it. These are different things. A strong person is someone who wins against equals. But here, there simply were no equals left. Throughout his life, he always compensated for his sense of inadequacy by imitating something grand, like, for example, the Olympics or the annexation of Crimea. According to psychologists, this is exactly how the small penis complex works. After all, deep down, Vova understands that he has remained small and worthless, a loser who just puts up with everything.
A person must respect themselves in order to be respected in the world, to be respected by those around them. Instead, he just runs in circles, getting kicked everywhere he goes, and each time these kicks become more humiliating and more costly for the country.
Over time, Vova surrounded himself with a retinue of loyal idiots.